Of One Hood's Power Hour, One Hood Power's Power Hour, I should say. My name is Ross Tedder. I'm the Civic Engagement Coordinator here. We're super excited and super grateful for who we have tonight. So this is supposed to be our candidate forum for Common Pleas. Pat Sweeney was on the one who responded for tonight. So we are super excited and grateful that he's here. So just a little bit about the Court of Common Pleas. This is a really important position. It's the second highest position. It's the highest position in the local judiciary. The other being the local magisterial courts, which is the first step in our criminal justice system. Court of Common Pleas being the second. And if you commit a serious crime or accused of committing a serious crime, you're most likely going to end up in front of a Court of Common Pleas judge. So a little bit about the candidate. Pat Sweeney has been a public defender for 25 years, working tirelessly on behalf of indignant clients, appearing in every division of the Court of Common Pleas. Patrick has tried dozens of jury trials, hundreds of non-jury trials, and he has counseled thousands of clients as a public defender, handling everything from shoplifting to homicide on a daily basis. Patrick understands, my eye is watering here. Patrick understands the role of a public defender to speak for the voiceless and bring justice to the dispossessed. Patrick is now running to be a judge on the Court of Common Pleas because for there to be true justice, a judge needs to listen to those voices. Court cases must be decided based on the facts and the law and not based on who has access to more resources or who benefits the most from systemic bias. Patrick has lived on the north side of Pittsburgh. Patrick lives on the north side of Pittsburgh, Alongside his legal career, he is the bargaining secretary unit of the Steelworkers Local 340374, which covers the public defenders, assistant DAs, and crime lab scientists. Patrick is also active in charitable organizations within the community, such as the Elks and his local parish. And so with that, I want to bring along Pat. And Pat, thank you so much for joining us today.
Here.
Thank you for joining us today, Pat.
Sure.
Absolutely.
I unfortunately, I'm the only one, I guess, who responded. So I guess I get to debate an empty chair or two. So,
oh man,
however you want to have at it, I'm happy to be here, actually. So
no, for sure. So it's just going to be one-on-one, and we're really happy that we have this time to discuss a lot of important issues with you. So
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So first things first, can you tell us a little bit about why you're running for this position?
Well, I've actually run for this before, but my reasons are the same. I have been a public defender pretty much my entire legal career, aside from a brief period right when I first passed the bar. I worked for an attorney up in Brookville, PA, which is one county north of Indiana County. Brookville is the county seat of Jefferson County, where Punxsutawney is. I went to high school actually in Indiana, Pennsylvania. I worked for basically, I describe it as being the third attorney in a two-man operation, where I learned a lot. This guy did everything. He was a true country lawyer, including criminal defense as well as civil actions. But I've been back in the public defender's office basically since 1997, and it's a real eye opener. I love my job. Obviously, I wouldn't have stayed as long as I have if I didn't find it very rewarding, and it's very enjoyable. But it can be also very frustrating because I see kind of the injustices that are baked into the system through the eyes of my clients and through my own practice. And I've been in front of a lot of good judges over the years, but I've been in front of some not so good judges too. And right now I'm an advocate. I can ask judges to make decisions that I think are based in justice and in law, but I'm not the decision maker. So the judge is the one that actually is the decision maker. And I want to be a decision maker that takes into account the life experiences of my clients and people like them, as well as the entire community to make sure that decisions are rendered justly and fairly for everyone. And that's my prime motivation for running.
Yeah, 100%. Like you sort of talked a little bit about like the injustices that are baked to the system. Can you talk a little bit more about like what sort of are those injustices that you see just on a basic level?
Well, just, obviously everyone I represent as a public defender by definition is indigent. They are unable to afford their own lawyer. They can't go out and hire someone, which means they're also behind the 8 ball when it comes to resources for expert witnesses and just preparation for trial. And of course, if you're incarcerated, you don't have access to any of that stuff. What I see baked into the system is my clients often find themselves with much longer periods of probation and much longer periods of supervision because they can't simply pay off their fees. When you are given a period of probation, let's say, very often, if there's restitution to be paid or if there are court costs to be paid, the judge will sort of dangle in front of you the opportunity to get an early termination once everything's paid off. Well, my clients, are often not only not able to pay it off early, very often their probations are being extended because they need more time to pay because they're poor. Also, at the front end of those processes, there are occasionally plea offers that are not really plea offers. They're called Rule 586 settlements. Let's say there's damage to a property or there's a theft. And if you make the victim whole before the trial date, you can get a complete withdrawal of the charges. My clients are in a much more difficult position in terms of executing such an arrangement because they don't have the money. Sometimes judges will allow sort of indefinite postponements to give them an opportunity to avail themselves of that. Sometimes they give you one postponement and they say, I'm not giving you another one for that reason. And that's the kind of thing that just being poor means your results are different and are, in terms of going forward, if you ever find yourself back in that same position, you're behind the 8 ball in terms of a higher prior record score. You have convictions on your record. It's going to be tougher for you to find a job. Even having a job is the kind of thing that is a mitigating factor in the eyes of some judges because they don't want to put somebody in jail who's actually a taxpayer and who's able to make a victim whole, let's say. So it tends to snowball. Also, there's a lot of discussion about cash bail and how if somebody's arrested, say on a Friday, and they don't see the judge until Monday or Tuesday, they might have actually lost their job because their shift was that weekend, or maybe that was the weekend they had their kids, and their ex now is trying to take away their visitation or their custody because they missed that weekend simply because they couldn't afford bail on something that they might actually be innocent of. They certainly haven't been proven guilty yet. They're presumed to be innocent, and simply having a financial barrier, I call it a financial surcharge on your presumption of innocence. Putting a financial barrier in front of you walking out of the jail after you've been charged is the kind of thing that could have almost lifetime consequences for you in terms of employment, in terms of just how you deal with your family. Also, just with rent, my clients, if they can't afford their lawyer, it means I often can't afford rent, and they find themselves in housing court. My clients are rarely covered by a collective bargaining agreement, like I am in the public defender's office. And so they're not necessarily protected at workplace from exploitation. A lot of them are working, if they are at all, under the table, and they don't have the kind of protections that a lot of workers in the workforce have. And I see how that seeps into almost every aspect of not only the criminal justice system, but the court system as a whole, in terms of how you can get justice. Because outside of criminal court, you don't really have a right to counsel. You don't have a right to counsel in housing court. You don't have a right to counsel in family court. There are some agencies that will represent people who are poor, but that's not a constitutional requirement. That's just something that's been set up by the courts to try and make things fair. But that is not an absolute right. And if somebody representing themselves is very, very often in a very difficult position in a civil action, something going on in family court or orphans court. So I see that problem and how not only does it affect my clients in criminal court, but throughout the entire criminal justice system.
Yeah. No, thank you for that very detailed answer for sure. And we're going to come back to a lot of what you just mentioned right there.
Sure.
Because a lot of that is baked in, what role as a judge, do you sort of have, right? Like, and as part of that role, right? Like, before you mentioned like the difference that there's a difference between a good judge and a bad judge, right? You've seen both. How does being a good judge, impact the systems that you just mentioned, right, and how they work in individuals' case, um, you know, uh, versus a legislative position, right, that can actually change policy, right? So like, sort of, what's the judge's role, and like what does a good judge look like in that role?
Well, in court, in a situation where, say, somebody is representing themselves, they're a pro se actor, in no matter what division you're in, a judge needs to be patient. Now, obviously, you're bound by the rules of evidence and the rules of court and how you introduce evidence and testimony, how you question people if you are representing yourself. However, the judge can go out of their way to make sure they're being fair in treating the pro se litigant and looking out for them, so they're not necessarily being taken advantage of by somebody who is represented by counsel. Courts can also have a role, and they're not legislative, and they certainly don't have the power to appropriate money, but they can be advocates for programs such as, say, Kids Voice or the Juvenile Court Project, or funding for neighborhood legalhood services, so they can represent people in housing court and in family court. The judges are very often leaned upon by policymakers to try and find out what's going on the ground and what's necessary. And judges can be, use their megaphone a little bit to make sure the policymakers appropriate money to allow for representation to be provided to people who can't afford it in situations where it is not a constitutional requirement. Now, my office, they're required to provide counsel to people that can't afford a lawyer when they're looking at incarceration, whether that be criminal actions, juvenile delinquency. Orphans court will eventually get appeals to mental health commitments. Our office represents people that are being involuntarily committed to a mental institution because that's a form of incarceration. But a judge had to rule at some point that was, interpret the Constitution and say, no, this is required. That is a decision that came down from the United States Supreme Court, that counsel is required. And so that was an action that a judge took. But also, just the way that the courts interact with defendants who are poor. And I think I alluded in my first answer how sometimes there are arrangements like that Rule 586 settlement, or if you're trying to get somebody into ARD, which is an actual diversion program, there's an upfront fee, or maybe there's a requirement that the restitution be paid down under a certain amount of money. You got to be lenient with continuances to allow people who are poor to save up enough money or borrow money or come up with the cash to avail themselves of those programs, because that's the thing that's separating them from getting an expunged record. And we don't want to have a situation where the courts are treating people who are poor more severely than people who have means. And there are judges, I hate to say it, who are much more strict when it comes to continuances. And I think they should take into account, maybe they just didn't spend enough time in the position that I'm in, advocating for people who are poor. But people need a break sometimes. And as much as we want to make victims whole, and we absolutely do, we want to make sure that the justice system treats poor people fairly, and that they have a crack at expungements and get a crack at ARD or a Rule 586 settlement. And you need to be a little more understanding, I think, in those scenarios.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. Yeah, that's a huge thing, right? I think just one thing that people forget, and not just in the court system, but overall in our legal system overall, is that, like, empathy goes a long way, right? Like, it's, we're not just, society does not just function in a governmental way, it also functions in a social way, right? That's important to remember. So, coming back to like the questions more so about you and your experience and your record, can you talk a little bit more about like the experience that you bring to this position, both as a public defender and maybe otherwise?
Well, as my little intro bio indicated, I've been with the office for 25 years. So I have had the opportunity to actually argue cases in all 4 divisions of the courthouse. I alluded to mental health commitment hearings. Those are the hearings themselves occur in front of hearing officers at mental health hospitals like Western Psych and St. Clair Hospital, formerly Mayview, places like that. The appeals of those involuntary commitment hearings are heard in front of orphans court judges, and I used to argue those for our office. Obviously, preliminary hearings, I did tons of those when I was early in the office and over the years as well. I was previously assigned in our juvenile division, which is under family court. And juvenile court, juvenile delinquency, very often I would have kids who had a delinquency matter, which is a criminal action, but also a dependency matter, where there's a problem with the home. There might be a failure to adjust. There might be truancy issues. There might be COIF involvement with the family. Parents might be going through a custody fight. So simply representing that the child who's got himself into trouble also opens your eyes as to this whole other cornucopia of other issues that are going on in families, and trying to restore some sort of normalcy to a family environment to make sure the kid doesn't end up back in the system over and over again. Civil division, oddly enough, civil contempts of court, and the most frequent contempt of court that I ever dealt with, of course, was protection from abuse orders. Those used to be heard by civil judges. So I used to argue those quite a bit over the years. But the overwhelming majority of my experience in the public defender's office has been in the adult trial division. As my bio said, I've tried dozens of jury trials over the years, from everything from shoplifting to homicide. I don't think there's a type of case that I haven't argued. We don't specialize in the public defender's office in the way that the district attorney's office does. So it actually gives us an opportunity to deal with every different type of case, whether it's a property crime, a narcotics crime, violent crime, sex offenses, all sorts of different interesting areas of the law that we have to deal with and represent people. And I think it keeps us fresh, and it keeps us from getting into a rut, because there's always some kind of legal issue or some factual issue that you can really sink your teeth in and try and learn about your client's circumstances and learn about the law as it applies. And that experience has been invaluable. Not only being in court almost every single day, being in court on all sorts of different issues with different people from all sorts of walks of life. And I don't think there's any experience that really prepares you for being a judge quite like that. I think this is probably the best job that I could do to prepare myself for being a trial court judge, not just in criminal court, but all sorts of types of cases, because of what we have to do to prepare and be an effective advocate for our clients.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. And so sort of in line with what you said about representing people from all different walks of life and from different backgrounds, what do you think links those people together, right? Because obviously there's differences and similarities. What have you noticed that those people share? And also, in particular, what do they share as potential, I guess in a legal sense, potential perpetrators of a crime, right? What do they have in common?
Well, I mean, what they all have in common, especially because they're my clients, is that they don't have any money, at least at that time. Yeah. There's a difference between being broke and being in poverty, and you learn that as a public defender. And there's a lot of my clients are simply broke or temporarily, economically embarrassed, or temporarily embarrassed millionaire, as they like to say. But all of my clients, at least at the time that I'm representing them, are in need. They don't have the ability to go out and hire their own lawyer and pay for their own defense. And that could be simply because they're incarcerated. There are people who, if you're incarcerated, are almost by definition indigent. Except for maybe that doctor that poisoned his wife who was locked up pre-trial. Almost everyone, if you're in jail, you're considered to be indigent, and you're going to be eligible for our services. But there are also people who are just stuck in chronic intergenerational poverty, and I've had parents and children over the years that I've represented, and siblings and uncles and people from the same families, and you see the cycle that perpetuates itself, and you also kind of get an insight as to, like I said, what the difference is between just being broke and also being in poverty, because a lot of it really comes down to lack of hope for the future and a lack of expectation that it's ever going to change, and there's something else out there for you. And what we try and do the best we can in our system is to get people out of that mindset where they feel that there's no other opportunity for them. There are job opportunities for people with criminal records. There are opportunities even for felons, and you got to keep working at it. And it is hard. It really is hard, but there is some hope out there, and we do the best we can to try and get people rehabilitated to the point where they're not coming back as repeat customers. In terms of what do they all have in common, aside from their own financial circumstances, they've got the weight of the government, weighing on their shoulders. Their liberty is at stake. Their good name is at stake, and very often they feel that it's their word against a cop, and that's a hard position to be in, even if you're a young black man at 18 years old, or a relatively crime-free person in their 50s, or well-educated white guy or gal from Hampton Township. To be accused of a crime that maybe you didn't commit is a pretty serious and scary position to be in for anyone. And that unites people. There's an old joke about how a liberal is a conservative who's been arrested, just like a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. The liberals I represent, the former conservatives who've been arrested, definitely get an eye opener as to what it's like to be on the other end of the police's activity, and that unites a lot of people in trying to say, hey, wait a minute, we should take a second look here and push back on just assuming everything the government does is correct and every accusation is accurate and true. So that's one thing all my clients have in common, for sure.
Thank you. No, thank you. I think holding space for that perspective is really important for anybody, but much more important for someone who is entering into a legal space. So thank you for that. Our next question. Judicial positions in general are seen, I would say, by the general public, sort of how you alluded to just now, right? In your scenario, as being very powerful and not necessarily always being the most honest, right? What will you do to sort of, ensure transparency, right? And also make sure that transparency is communicated to your constituents?
Well, I mean, transparency is, I think that word, tends to lend itself better to other forms of other branches of government than maybe the judiciary. I think what judges need to take into account, and it's something that judicial candidates, we have to take into account as well, because we actually are limited on what we can say about certain issues. And the reason for that is because we want everyone, no matter what their views, what their walk of life is, what kind of job they have or lack thereof, to expect that they're going to be treated fairly when they come into the courthouse. They want a judge that's going to call balls and strikes and not have their thumb on the scale already, in favor of a certain class of individuals, a certain race, a certain economic situation. And judges need to be mindful that the things that they say, not only on the campaign trail, but certainly from the bench, and the attitudes that they display can send messages that are often unintentional. I've certainly had clients, that based on not only the actual rulings that a judge would make in pretrial motions and during trials, but also just the attitude displayed from the bench in terms of facial expressions and tone of voice, really felt that the judge had a bias against them, and it affected the way trials are conducted and the way they approach risking conviction as opposed to taking a plea. And judges, I think, need to be mindful of their behavior in that way, that they're not necessarily even unintentionally tipping off some sort of bias against someone, whether it be an individual or a class of people. And I, because I've been through that, and because I've actually had clients express those concerns about bias in a judge. It's something that's, I think it's always going to weigh with me if I am fortunate enough to be elected, to be mindful to not, give off any impression that I'm anything other than fair. And I think that given the diversity of who I've represented over the years, even though every one of them has been poor, I've represented people from all parts of this county, all parts of this country, national origin, race, creed, sexual orientation, you name it. I've represented someone from every conceivable type of subgroup of society, and every one of them deserves a judge that is going to treat them fairly. And that's something I'm always going to bring with me if I am lucky enough to win. So.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, sort of in line with that and that honesty. Justice is a concept that like a lot of people define differently. So I guess like, how do you define justice, and specifically, how do you define equal justice, right? And then what steps will you take to ensure that equal justice, are made in the courtroom?
Well, I mean, obviously, like at the base level, everyone has a right to have their story heard. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have a right to be believed. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have a right to win, but they all should at least come away feeling that they got to argue their side, and that there was no bias. And I know that there are frustrations expressed by people that they feel that their voice is not heard in whether it be the criminal justice system, family court. Certainly, there people have tremendous fears about biases, that judges may harbor against husbands and fathers, or against gays and lesbians in custody situations. And I think that true justice is a situation where not necessarily that we can predict the outcome of every case that comes in front of the court, but that we can guarantee that everyone starts off in a fair position and got to have their say and got to make their argument, and that argument was listened to. That's what I would define as justice. Now, writ large, we certainly see the difference in outcomes, and particularly when it comes to race and criminal justice, and that is it's like a canary in the coal mine. If you see the overwhelming majority of the population of the jail being African American in a county that's 13% African American, the sheer volume of young men with criminal convictions and felony convictions among young Black men, as opposed to other aspects of society, that is a red flag. That doesn't necessarily mean that every one of them was innocent. They might have actually done the crime. But you can't look at those statistics without thinking to yourself, hey, wait a minute, how did we get to this position where, the overwhelming majority of the people locked up in that county jail are African American men? It screams that there might be something systemic, that we're dealing with. And that, of course, that comes down to racism and economic issues and the inability to overcome, hundreds of years of issues like slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination here in the North, and that legacy still weighs on all of us, and we're dealing with that. But yes, every case is different, and every individual that comes before you is different. But you also have to be able to take a step back and look systemically and think, all right, maybe we're not doing everything right. Maybe there's something we can look at here as to why these outcomes are skewed in the way that they are.
Yeah, no, for sure. So like, and that's a perfect segue to the next question, which is just, in what way specifically that you can definitively say right now from the position that you stand in, in what way does the judiciary impact Black communities, right? Like you talked about the jail population, but what other ways?
Well, it isn't just jail population; it's also probation supervision and dealing with issues like truancy and in family court as well. There are skewed outcomes in many different ways that are not even a part of the criminal justice system. A lot of that's economic. Obviously a judge doesn't have the ability to create fair employment that doesn't exist, and we don't necessarily have the ability to bring steel mills back with higher paying jobs. But what we can do is take into account at least what got someone in front of us in the first place, and have that factor into our decision making, and not only in terms of access to the court, but also the type of remedy that we attempt to apply. My clients in the public defender's office, yes, the majority of them, certainly pretty solid majority of them are poor African Americans, mostly men. But very often the victims of crimes, my clients are often victims of crimes as well. So to say that you're going to go easier on somebody simply because they happen to be, from a poor Black family, that doesn't necessarily bring justice to the scenario if that particular crime requires a tough sentence, like a violent crime. Mm-hmm. Economic crime, that's a different story. And nonviolent crimes and drug-related crimes, I think, we just have completely wrong-headed attitudes towards how we approach those issues. And the wrong-headed attitude very often involves longer sentences, longer probationary sentences, and longer terms of incarceration for poor Black men who end up ensnared in those walks of life. The getting back to the whole lack of hope for the future. A young kid who doesn't see a reason to avoid getting involved in that type of activity will find himself with juvenile court actions and maybe a felony that sticks with him when he's an adult. And then he gets discouraged because he can't find a job. And he's more likely to get ensnared back into that life because he has trouble, finding decent work. And that's wrapped up into why people end up in front of us in the first place, and why they end up my clients, and why they would end up in front of a judge. And when you're thinking of remedies, is the way we're doing things working? I mean, the whole point of criminalizing narcotics trade and use is because I think rightly recognize we don't want people to be addicted to drugs. We're not necessarily even coming close to incarcerating our way out of this addiction problem. And so I think systemically we need to figure out a different way to handle it. Locking people up either for dealing or for using, it's not working. It's not preventing people from becoming addicts. And I think we need to approach property crime, people that are involved with drugs, people that are involved with drugs very often because they have mental health issues as well, and judges need to take that into account. Now, I can't order that a whole class of college kids become psychologists and psychiatrists, but we can beat the drum and use that megaphone that I referenced earlier in my remarks to cry out to policymakers that we need to fund things like mental health treatment, dual diagnosis treatment that involves not only mental health issues, but also drug addiction issues. So we can get kids and young people earlier on in the system away from a carceral solution into some type of treatment solution. And that way they don't find themselves back in front of the criminal justice system. And that's something judges can have a lot to say over.
No, for sure. For sure. No, thank you for that answer. I feel like this is a really detailed, interview thus far. Probably one of our better ones that we've had, to be honest with you. So, going back to justice, right? You kind of defined it as being like, de facto everyone being heard, not necessarily being believed, but just to be heard.
Sure.
What mechanisms, in the county court system, do you see as a barrier to folks being heard? You mentioned just like lack of empathy and potentially like implicit bias, but yeah, like what mechanisms kind of uphold that?
Well, I think that what you're describing there are things that might be a barrier for an individual jurist, from actually being on their receiving end, being a fair person. And you've always got to be mindful. We've been through implicit bias training as public defenders, and if you've ever, if you work in a big enough workplace, you probably had to go through some HR videos. I mean, some of it seems like a little bit of gobbledygook and a lot of catchphrases, but you do need to be mindful of your potential biases. and also recognize systemic issues, such as just the way police are deployed. There may be, we talk about driving while black laws jokingly, but there's a real issue with that in certain municipalities, and the way officers are deployed from the get-go produces more police interactions, which produces more car searches, which produces more, confiscations of drugs and guns, and perhaps maybe even resisting arrest and all sorts of other issues, which might land someone in a criminal action. The way you deploy your officers, if they are directed at certain neighborhoods that have overwhelming African American population, you're going to produce more cases in criminal court. That officer might not be a racist. That magistrate who's deciding whether to release them might not be a racist. The judge who hears the case, the prosecutor who prosecutes it might not be a racist. The jury that hears the case might not be racist, but there's a systemic issue there, and that tends to produce outcomes. And while that individual person may have had counsel and may have been speaking to a very fair judge, there's an issue with fairness of that system that we need to all take a step back and look at. That individual might be heard, but they're more likely to be in a position where they need to be heard because of the way, say, police are deployed, and that can be just as problematic as a judge or a prosecutor or a police officer who harbors very open racist views. That could be just as damaging to our society and the relationship between the police and the courts and the community, and the way people feel they're being treated by the system. Also getting into, and I know we've talked about this earlier in my remarks as well, outside of criminal court, almost everyone in housing court, including the landlords, by the way, are representing themselves. And not all landlords are created equal. I mean, there might be a couple that buys the other half of their duplex and rents it out, and they may want to evict somebody because they're wrecking the place. A magistrate and a judge who hears an appeal to that needs to take into account the fact that neither of the litigants here are being represented by counsel very often, and you got to be able to make sure that they all know what the rules are and what a fair system is, and they need to know that they're being heard, and they need to know that they're not being railroaded or being taken advantage of. And there needs to be more, I think, volunteer efforts by lawyers, and very often maybe it's a resources issue where the courts need to fund programs like neighborhood legal services and similar type of arrangements where we can have counsel appointed for people in housing court, in family court, that handle these small claims. And that way, not only is the process served better, but the people who are a part of it feel that they're not being railroaded and they're being heard. So that way, I think that's a way for people to feel heard because they know that there's somebody actually speaking on their behalf that knows what they're doing.
100%. You kind of just answered my next question a little bit, which was just about the housing crisis that's facing a lot of Pittsburgh residents, and sort of to the extent that you can answer without compromising yourself. What are your views on that housing crisis? And you mentioned a little bit just a judge taking into account the circumstances of an argument, right? As being a way that judge can play a role in that.
Sure.
What other roles can the judge play in ensuring that residents and I guess landlords for that matter too, are treated fairly in this day and age that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, just because of the pandemic, and which happens to be simultaneous with this sort of housing crisis that was independently occurring, having a moratorium on evictions is a sort of one size fits all solution that isn't necessarily a just one. There are scenarios where a landlord has a tenant who they want out of there not because they're not paying rent, but because they're afraid they're going to wreck the place, and that they're annoying their other tenants, and they're preventing their other tenants from being able to enjoy their property. There are some big corporate landlords in this town, but there's also a lot of small mom and pop landlords that this is sort of the bridge from the working class into the middle class, being able to like have a rental property or two or three maybe that provides intergenerational wealth, which is something that working class people of all races, but in particular African Americans, there's not as much housing equity in the Black community and in poor communities as there are in white middle class communities. And one of the ways to acquire that is to occasionally, buy a low cost rental property and rent it out. And you need to be able to make sure you can get your money. You need to be able to make sure that you can maintain it. And very often those mom and pop landlords don't have the money for a lawyer because their mortgage on that second house is dependent on that rent. There are programs in place now where there's mediation that housing issues, as long as both sides agree, they go to mediation, between the magistrate and the common pleas court level. And I think that's actually a pretty good reform because it's less costly. It allows another set of eyes into the problem. And if it is a situation where that maybe a tenant realizes, look, they're never going to be able to afford to stay in a house like this, they need to move on. Let's reach some sort of fair compromise that gives them some time to move out and get a new place, and gets the landlord the ability to get in there and fix the place up and rent it to a new tenant. Those are good opportunities, and that's a program that's already in place, and it's this kind of thing I think should continue. And it's also a situation where, as long as both sides agree, that you can have an attorney appointed to sort of mediate that issue and act as kind of a go-between. That's a way, I think, in terms of housing court, that it's a reform that's already taken place, and it's something that I think needs to be expanded. But in terms of like the issue writ large, I mean, obviously, we have a scenario where there's a lot of big investment funds that are buying up rental properties with the expectation there's going to be an income stream that they really shouldn't be expecting. And it's jacking up the cost of buying a home. It's jacking up the cost of rent. And it isn't necessarily, in many ways, it's taking properties off of the market. And it's driving up rents, even in neighborhoods that are not, the hot cachet, neighborhoods that are really having spikes in property values. In terms of policy arguments, I mean, believe me, I'm at a loss for that. I mean, anyone who runs for mayor or county executive is going to have to come up with some issues as to how we can build more housing and build more housing at the bottom end and not necessarily at the top end and have it trickle down. But the way the courts are handling it, I think it's to try and be innovative as they've already begun, and to try and perpetuate some of those programs where you mediate these issues, and it isn't going from crisis to crisis between the landlord and the tenant. I think that's the best way to handle it.
100%, 100%. Yeah, no, I mean, so that's that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate your nugget on small landlords. Something to consider for sure. Yeah, no, so sort of in line with the housing crisis and just Allegheny County's larger equity issues, writ large, right? What do you see as the biggest, challenge facing Allegheny County right now? And as a legal professional, who is, aiming to, move up into a judge position, how does that impact your philosophy?
Well, I think, just as a citizen, I think one of the biggest problems isn't something that a judge really has a whole lot to do with, which is trying to promote economic development that's environmentally safe and sustainable and all that. As an attorney, as a practitioner, I think a lot of the issues that are sort of hot button right now in terms of voters and their relationship with the courts are the criminal justice reform issues, and it's a real crisis. I think that we're finally getting some public sentiment behind in addressing mental health disorders impacts on individuals. Like the overwhelming majority of the cases that I handle are not, sexy, flashy crimes like bank robberies or shootings or homicides. They're everyday people with mental health problems, and very often that mental health problem was something that was undiagnosed as a child, which led them into drug and alcohol abuse. And drug and alcohol abuse is the overwhelming driver of the crimes that I see and our courts see day in and day out. And the kind of the interconnectedness between drug and alcohol abuse and mental health disorders, and our inability to treat them, and our inability to sort of keep people on a straight track. Oftentimes somebody lands in jail for a week or two. They might detox, they get out. Next thing you know, they're using drugs like they were using 3 weeks ago, and they overdose. The sort of the boomerang effect of being in and out of jail all the time when you're going through those addiction issues, very often driven by mental health issues. The jail is not an effective mental health hospital, and that's what we're trying to turn it into. Our prisons are basically becoming our mental health hospitals. There used to be 19 mental health hospitals in this state. Excuse me. Now there's 2, and there's only one in the western part of the state, and that's Torrance. When I first started as a public defender, we still had Mayview here, but it was already on the way to being closed. The lack of resources for mental health treatment. They were supposed to replace those brick and mortar hospitals with community treatment, and they just didn't fund it. Our society needs to fund that. Our society needs to not only at the front end fund that, but also understand that when people are in the criminal justice system because of these issues, simply locking them up in a jail is not going to give them the tools to stay straight once they get out. And they're going to get out. We're not going to put them in jail for life. They're going to get right back out on the street, and they're going to be dealing with that very acute mental health issue, which, causes them to melt down in a grocery store, or causes them to act out at the hospital, or causes them to, use drugs and get into that cycle of theft and repeating, getting arrested over and over again. We need to address that. And we have an opportunity, because I think people are finally realizing that our way of dealing with addiction and our way of dealing with the cause of addiction is not working. And we have an opportunity here to fund mental health interventions and drug and alcohol interventions in a way that is not necessarily expensive incarceration. And that's going to be, and eventually it's going to be cheaper for everybody. It's going to take a while to get there. But that, I think, is the most pressing issue in our courts, in our society. And I think I'm excited, because I think we actually have some headwind where the voters are actually electing people that want to accomplish this. And obviously I want to be a part of that as much as I can.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that answer. That was really detailed. What's sort of like, a tough decision in your legal career, right, that you've had to make, right? Could be in a tough case, could be, whatever. But how did you handle it?
Well, we talk about a lot. I mean, obviously we have continuing legal ed, and every year part of that has to be ethics. So what do you do in a scenario where your client, you might have a good defense, whether it be, evidence was gathered illegally, and you can get the case thrown out, but you also know that your client needs to go to treatment, and they've offered them, a place, and there's actually a bed available for them. How do you handle that as ethically as a lawyer? And I find my role to be that I'm trying to get them the best outcome legally, and as hard as it is in that scenario, I think the right call ethically is to try and get the case thrown out, and hope and pray that maybe there's some other workaround for them to get the treatment that they need. But judges are often in this difficult decision as well, and it was a frustrating thing in family court when I was in juvenile, and I see that also in mental health commitment hearings as well. There are potentially lifelong or nearly lifelong consequences to adjudicating a kid delinquent, particularly if it's a felony. But often judges will say, well, we have to do that because we can't get them into this program that has funding without it. And we can't just send them back to their family or send them back to their grandparents. So the only way to help them is adjudicate them delinquent and then send them off and have them participate in this program. But you keep doing that, and it ratchets up their involvement in the criminal justice system. It also might have consequences as an adult. Let's say they're 23 and they get arrested again. Now they're looking at higher prior record score. The potential negative outcomes on a future sentence are greater, all because we tried to help the kid when he was 15. And you see that in mental health commitment hearings. Our county commits way more people involuntarily than any other county in Pennsylvania, in the thousands. And a lot of times it's because they feel that this is a person who's suffering. Maybe they are not a threat to themselves or others, which is the standard to involuntarily commit someone. Maybe they're not a threat, but they need help, and that their situation has gotten worse. And the only way to help them is to put them in here for 60 days or 90 days. That could have consequences. Let's say they own a gun. Let's say they own a hunting rifle. Let's say 15 years from now, there's a gun in their car. Now they're looking at a felony charge. And somebody who has been in and out of the mental health system a lot has probably been out of the criminal justice system a lot. And your sentencing guidelines on those gun cases are through the roof, and you're looking at state prison, all because you were involuntarily committed, not because you deserve to be legally, but because morally, our society does not fund mental health the way it should be. And a judge or hearing officer felt they had no choice but to involuntarily commit you because they wanted to help you. And it's hard. It's a tough thing to do for a judge, just like it's a tough thing to do as a lawyer, to say, no, throw this case out. No, find this person not guilty, even though we can't send this kid to this nice program that we think is a good idea. But that's the hard decision that judges have to make sometimes. And I think to do the right thing, you gotta remember your role, and that, my experience has been a lot of times judges don't remember their role, and it's unfortunate. So.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that answer, and thank you so much for this interview today. As we sort of come to a close, and sort of talking about roles. What has been your role as a member of the community, and how has that influenced how you see Pittsburgh?
Well, I came back to Pittsburgh for college. Like I said, I'm originally from the North Side. My dad got a job at IUP, so the family moved up to Indiana, PA. That's where I went to high school. I came back to Pittsburgh and went to Pitt for my undergrad years and law school. And aside from that brief period of time up in Brookville, I've been back in Pittsburgh. I'm a city dweller, and I'm back on the north side actually now, living over in the central north side now. I have always felt that, it's something I took to heart. Somebody must have said it to me at some point in my youth. If you see problems out there, instead of complaining about it, get involved and change it. If you're a member of an organization and you don't think it's being run in the proper way, run for an office in the organization. So I've always felt that if I have something to offer, I'm gonna offer it up, whether it be as a member of the community. In my parish, we have an organization called St. Vincent de Paul Society, where we would visit families, and this was in the South Side. I lived over there in the hilltop part of the South Side, and it was sort of St. Vincent de Paul is kind of a mixture between the Red Cross and Goodwill. They have stores that provide low cost, housing vouchers and clothes and furniture, but also we would have families in crisis. Maybe there was a fire or something. They need mattresses, or they got evicted and they need mattresses, and they need furniture for the kids, that kind of thing. So, I participate in that. I've been involved in my neighborhood organization as well. Our problems in the central north side are far fewer than there used to be, which is actually part of I think the success of the people that preceded me in my neighborhood organization. But it's always been something I felt that if you're going to be a good citizen, you need to get involved in your community and try and make it better. That's why I ran for office in my union. Our office, we're members of the United Steelworkers, and we're not allowed to go on strike, so we have to go to arbitration. But we also have situations where you're sort of the public defender of the workplace. A coworker gets in trouble with the boss. They need to make sure that the contract is followed, and that that they're treated fairly, that the process plays out the way it's supposed to. And I volunteered and ran for office in that organization. I'm now the secretary of the whole bargaining unit, which includes the DAs who actually argue cases against. And we had a really big success this last time around. We kind of shamed the county back to the bargaining table. We actually signed a contract for the first time in our union's existence, instead of going to arbitration. And the starting salary is going to go from $45,000 to $65,000, which is a huge lifestyle changing improvement for the young attorneys in our office. They're going to be able to stick around instead of quitting after 2 or 3 years because they can't afford to stay. And people in both offices, the DA's office and the public defender's office, a lot of times they're true believers. They want to serve the public in their own way, and they found that they can't afford to stay. And so getting involved in the union was my way of trying to help change that and improve that. And that's something I've always felt is required of you as a citizen, to not just complain, but to actually step forward and offer yourself up and to make some change for the better. So,
yeah. Thank you. So. Well, that brings us to time. So is there, before we close out, do you want to say anything else to folks watching at home?
Well, look, I really appreciate the opportunity. Like I said, I got a lot more time to talk than I normally would in a forum with multiple candidates here. But the folks watching at home, organizations like One Hood are right in my wheelhouse in terms of the candidate that I am, the kind of coalition I'm trying to build as I run for office. I think it's important that any candidate for countywide office, particularly the court, have a broad base of support. And organizations like One Hood are, in my opinion, a key component of my potential electoral coalition. So I'm glad that if you're watching, you took the time to watch, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm honored to be here. And I'd love to keep the conversation going. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you again to Patrick Sweeney for joining us tonight. Again, candidate for Allegheny County Court of Common Pleas. The election is May 16th. I don't know definitively when the dates for mail-in voting ends, but that's coming up like several weeks before that. So if you have a mail-in ballot you're running to, definitely request it if you haven't already requested it. And if you requested it, return that as soon as possible. So, but yeah, y'all, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.
All right.
Over the course of a few years, life yielded a crisis of pandemics, resulting in many reeling and searching for answers. Black men especially have had to grieve the passing of hip-hop icons DMX, Michael K. Williams, Biz Markie, and many others. How has this impacted Black men? How has this altered the way they see themselves, their ability to express themselves, and their mental health? We sit down with Black men raised on the culture of hip-hop and ask them directly, let's have a bite, take a step back in order to move forward. I'm your host, Miracle Jones, and this is Brunch with the Black Man.